afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Education and Skills Service Transformation Committee of the 19th of February 2025. So I'll dive straight into the agenda. I don't think any apologies are necessary today. So welcome to people in the room and welcome online. First, do we have any apologies for absence? No, none received. And secondly, do we have any disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests? None. No one indicating. And third, we move on to the minutes of the last meeting held on the 15th of January. So can I go through page by page? For accuracy, page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. If you are content, then I can sign them as a correct record of the meeting. Everyone happy? Hands up, nodding heads, thumbs. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so we move on to agenda item number 4, policy on the principles of pupil progression. So can I hand over to Helen Morgan-Rees, please?
Just want to say a few words in relation to this report. I'm sure our Principal School Improvement Officer, Di Thomas, will take us through the main points of the report and indeed the recommendations themselves. But I'm very pleased that the committee has worked on pupil progression in Swansea. I think this is something that is really important for the Directorate to get a grip on in terms of our schools, and to ensure that there is parity and consistency in how our schools view pupil progression. So from my perspective as Director of Education, I think it's really important that we've set out our stall in Swansea and that our expectations are consistent across schools. What schools choose to do with these principles is largely up to them, but I think it can be a useful tool for them to understand really what we mean by pupil progression. So I'm really grateful for the work of the team in getting to this point where we're able to share a draft with you today of those principles of progression. Thank you.
That's excellent. So we are moving on then to Di to take us through the, Cabinet Member Robert Smith. Councillor Smith?
Just to say, echo what Helen has said really, and thank Di for the work that's gone into preparing this report and indeed preparing the policy that we're looking at this afternoon. Looking back, it must be about 10 years ago now, when the Donaldson report came out. I think, yes, the ideas about curriculum reform were fine, but when it came to progression and pupil progression, I'm not saying there was a gap, but I don't think the same level of thought had been given to those issues. And I'm not saying by Donaldson, but by the system in general, as had been given to the Donaldson principles in terms of the curriculum. So I think this is a much needed contribution. We don't want our schools being left in a position where they are having to work their own way without any kind of guidance or reference point. And I think this, if the schools choose to use it, and I think Helen has made that point, this will provide a useful reference point for them moving forward. That's going to make their lives a lot easier. So those are my thoughts as we kick off the discussion, Chair, but I think it's appropriate now that Di goes through the report with us. We can have comments afterwards.
Lovely. Thank you, Robert. So over to you, Di.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just confirm that you can hear me as I'm off-site in a strange place?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. Thanks. It's good to see you all, and thanks, Helen and councillors, for your input. And it's a useful piece of work, certainly. You'll be aware of the presentations that I've made and others have made in contribution to the development of this piece. If I could turn initially, Chair, to the report, what we're asking is for consideration of the draft policy as an appendices, but comments and questions from councillors, if possible, to help further shape this. And then secondly, that you give us permission to go out to wider stakeholders so that we can get their views. And what that would look like is firm consultation, or rather seek stakeholder views from school-based colleagues in order for them to get have input in this. And the reason for that is because, as you'll be aware, that'll secure firm buy-in from those at the chalk face. So from those school-based practitioners who effectively, as Helen has outlined, will be undertaking these principles when they're in front of children and young people. So that's the report. Not a huge amount of detail in the report, Chair. Those two asks front and centre. The report contains broad principles of curriculum for Wales. So, and for me specifically, what's the principal purpose of assessment? And I think we've established that, both with our engagement with other practitioners in the field, that the principal purpose of assessment is to understand pupil progression, and in a nutshell, what is it that we need to do in order to make each pupil make appropriate progress at a pace that meets their needs best, and that's all children and young people. So overarchingly, that's what the detail in the report. And what we have done is identified potential risks through an assessment in terms of this report, and those risks we believe would be mitigated in current format by the professional learning that's offered to schools and school-based colleagues by our curriculum learning and teaching team headed up by myself and Jenna Gravel. So what I'm trying to say is there's nothing in here that we would expect schools not to be doing now, but this would just, as Helen has described, provide some consistency and setting out our stall in Swansea. So before I go on to just highlighting aspects of the proposed policy, are there any questions on that from the floor, Chair?
Committee members, there's no one indicating in the room. Online, any questions so far? Councillor Lyndon Jones, please.
I think I'd say, David, and great to read the principles, the draft and the principles and so on, but it's good to be putting meat on the bone, really, so that it actually is in writing what we need to do and achieve, and I think that's important. So well done for putting that together.
Thanks, Lyndon. No one else there, you can continue, I think.
Okay, thanks. So you will have had sight of the draft policy, and overarchingly, two key approaches categorised into one, teaching, learning and assessment, and two, more specifically, Swansea's principles of progression. And I think it's really important that we make it clear that that is a Swansea's principle of progression, because Welsh Government's Curriculum for Wales guidance contains something called the 12 pedagogical principles. Broadly speaking, my view is they're underused, and possibly because they don't mean enough to practitioners. And my view is that they weren't engaged in the development of those principles at the Curriculum for Wales level. So really key piece of work for us going forwards with this item will be to engage with stakeholders and school-based practitioners. So apologies, shout loudly, please, Chair, if someone puts their hand up, because I'm operating on one screen here, so I won't necessarily see everything going on. So in terms of section 1, teaching, learning and assessment, obviously to highlight, to support pupil progress, and I think it's really key. Some of these items here, I'm just going to highlight some big ticket items from my perspective. Pace and challenge being appropriate for all pupils. Having high expectations, which is obviously really clear, but we would be able to do that through a number of the forthcoming items. So questioning and feedback, and that links into response to learning. So one thing I will say is these items that sit underneath 1.1 teaching, we've considered that the curriculum learning and teaching team can provide and do provide professional learning in each of these areas currently. And I know that Kate is in the non-virtual room when it comes to the top item on page 2 around additional needs. But you'll hear me say all high tides float all boats. What that means is good teaching is good teaching. So whether a pupil has an identified ALN, additional learning need, or otherwise, we would expect a good teaching to be able to support those pupils anyway. A key focus for us would be to promote independence, but not just to make pupils be able to do things on their own. That independence is more broad than that, so that they can work collaboratively as well. But ideally, it'll create a sense that they can solve critical problems themselves. And this sense of autonomy, so that pupils have, like schools, have autonomy in the way that they both design their own learning, but can find their own solutions to problems. In terms of learning outcomes, a number of items here which both reflect where we're at in Swansea, but the national picture as well. So it's really important that pupils develop skills and they acquire skills. And those skills, as we would see them, would be listening, speaking, reading, writing, numeracy, and digital literacy. So when we talk about skills, we talk about those items. But the application of those skills across the curriculum is really important. So the digital, the LNF, the Literacy Numeracy Framework, are being revised by Welsh Government at the moment. And what's really important is that pupils are provided with opportunities to both develop and apply their learned skills in other contexts across the curriculum. And the reason for that is because it deepens that learning when you can apply it to different practical elements across the curriculum. Another key item for me is the development of a proficient Welsh language across our Swansea schools. We've got a particularly strong team that supports our Welsh language provision in Swansea. I'm very keen to make that front and centre in this item. And I'm very keen that we promote positive attitudes to learning. And schools do a particularly good job in Swansea. You'll be aware of presentations from schools, and scrutiny have been to see a number of those. So keen to have it front and centre. Not to cut across, but to complement the work at the head of service, Vulnerable Learners, Kate, who's in the room, obviously, around participation and behaviour, so that we promote positive behaviour and that supports active learning. I've mentioned problem solving, but the word perseverance springs to mind. We do need to try and develop learners' perseverance. That's something that parents of younger pupils tell us it's a real challenge for them, perhaps, although dare I say it, because of missed learning through the times when they weren't in school. So the development of that perseverance is something that we need to consider. And although you would expect our practitioners, school-based practitioners, to have positive working relationships, that's still a focus for us, because those positive relationships are really key in order to facilitate effective learning. And something that is never off the agenda is feedback and response to feedback. So we would expect to be able to develop a sense where pupils feel comfortable to responding to the feedback and feed forward that they're given to by practitioners in schools. And of course, of high importance, but one that is a challenge to schools and settings across the piece, but certainly in Swansea too, is how we involve parents and carers. And there's some really clear Welsh Government guidance through the transition plans, which this curriculum learning and teaching team are supporting schools in that piece. 1.3 talks about curriculum and the design of a curriculum, and something that often since Curriculum for Wales's inception in 2022 seems to have gone off the boil. Well, we're promoting heavily that the Curriculum for Wales is subject in each school is subject to ongoing review as per the guidance. And as part of that review, we make sure that the curriculum is both broad, so that it's not too narrow in its approach, so that it covers all 6 areas of learning experience with equal weighting, and that it provides pupils with opportunities to develop their skills, their knowledge and experience in a range of localized contextual matters. Obviously, we've talked about our linguistic development, but certainly how do pupils use the language of their local area. Chair, we've spoken about this and you've provided examples, so this is certainly trying to exemplify in some ways how we reflect the local area whilst celebrating our wider diversity in the world in which we live. The bottom of page 6 talks about authenticity, and of course, you know, it's never far from our minds. We need to provide an authentic curriculum for our school-based learners, so that the pupils who live in one area can learn about matters that relate to the place that they wake up every morning and the place that they walk to school. And we do need to promote a sense of understanding of different societies. Currently being on an anti-racism day today with the National Academy, talking about the challenges that school leaders face in terms of upskilling their staff and communities to have a better understanding of the diverse world in which we live and celebrate that work. We often forget forget about the creative and artistic development that's required. Some schools do it particularly well, but given the foci of digital literacy and numeracy skills, it can be forgotten. And therefore, linking to encouraging and engaging learners, we need to be really clear that that's a priority for us as well. Of course, we want to be able to ask and require pupils to be able to reflect on the effectiveness of their relationships with others. So the RVE and RSE curriculum really key in this item here. And lastly, not least, pupils having healthy lifestyle choices linked to the humanities piece of work and health and well-being piece of work in the curriculum. But it's really important that we promote pupils and develop their understanding and knowledge in terms of promotion of their healthy lifestyle. So that's not only us providing good role models, but also colleagues in catering and cleaning services to make sure that we provide good role models for pupils in terms of healthy diets and their physical activity. And lastly on this, on teaching, learning and assessment is of course assessment itself, and you'll see from 141 the whole purpose of assessment is to enable progression for each learner. So an ongoing process as we described in previous presentations to this group, and as I've described, progression in learning. What is learning, first of all? Well, learning as defined by Curriculum for Wales is the development of skills, knowledge and understanding, and the deepening of understanding through a well-planned curriculum, which is underpinned by rich experiences. And the three big ones from my perspective would be supporting progress on an ongoing day-to-day basis, and we would utilise some of the teaching and learning approaches that were aforementioned in the first section of the report, for example, ongoing continual feedback and dialogue with teachers and obviously with pupils, but that leads to a better understanding of individual learner progress over time. So through those day-to-day observations and recording of their progress using whatever method the school chooses. Reflecting on that progress is really important, not only to support school improvement initiatives, but also to reflect on what we do and don't do for our children and young people. So it's about planning for the provision and changing what we do in order to provide the most suitable opportunities and experiences, but also to be able to engage with our parents, with our children and young people and their parents, in order to ensure that they can best support when they're not in school with us. And I've mentioned group progress. Group progress, from our perspective, is very useful, obviously, to understand how similar groups of pupils make progress so that we can change the practice or provision. But it's also a very useful tool to inform school improvement. And lastly, in that item, of course, when we fully understand what's required on a day-to-day basis, on an individual basis over time, and for group pupils over time, that will, of course, inform our pedagogy, our approaches to teaching and learning. What do we need to do in front of children and young people differently tomorrow that we did today? I'll pause there, Chair, just in case there's any questions before we move on to the individual principles.
Thank you, Di. Please indicate, councillors online and in the room, if you have any questions. One thing for me, at 1.26 referring to perseverance, do we relate here? I remember the psychologist Carol Dweck and growth mindset, the idea that we always need to be continual in our learning and that we need to develop grit and determination. I always remember the idea of rather than saying putting a big F on a test and saying fail, see me, we say, you're not there yet. You know, that kind of encouragement to encourage people to keep trying and not give up. So is that the context we're thinking of there, Di?
Yeah, absolutely. Perseverance describes it really well, and we would have to avoid using terminology such as growth mindset, Chair, given it's potentially a scheme or an initiative. But absolutely, the principles that underpin that piece of work is exactly what we're trying to achieve here.
Great, thank you. Councillor Mike White.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks, Di. Thanks for the report. In regards to the issue around health eating and children at school, would it be possible perhaps to work in partnership with businesses within the community? Plus, we could sort of work with them to encourage children to perhaps grow their own. If there's areas within the school where they could perhaps do this, some sort of growing and planting of vegetables. Perhaps if perhaps we could look at this as the authority to see if we could encourage schools to perhaps roll this out.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. I am aware of individual initiatives in different sites and schools across the city. I'm not currently aware of any firm initiative that's supporting that, each individual school and setting. But certainly what I'll do, we'll try and consider that so that there can be a more common approach. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Councillor Lyndon Jones.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Yeah, really good. When you talked about curriculum design, I think what is important there, and is something that Scrutiny have done, is to look at cluster working and how that fits into that, because I think it's quite important that we get those clusters to work together. Each individual cluster working together with a comprehensive school, and I think that's important when they're looking to design. I was looking at I was shown some examples yesterday about understanding societies, how Bishopston Comprehensive School were using podcasts, and people were then interviewing fellow students or pupils and how they were finding out about what they were doing, what their backgrounds were, and they were finding a lot of common ground as well. And I thought it was really good, and it was quite challenging, but also really interesting how it brought a lot of them together, because they learned a bit about each other that they didn't know before. And I think, and under that, I think that is quite important. And the other point, the third one and last one, is that progression in learning. How do we compare with the curriculum in England? Because ultimately, not all our pupils will go to universities in Wales. So how are they in comparison to what's happening in England? Are we ahead of them, or are we falling behind? And I think that is quite important, because obviously a lot of them will be competing for places at English universities. And those will be my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Lyndon. Councillor Robert Smith.
Yes, thank you, Jen. What I would say, looking at page 15, page 16, rather, I think if there is a summary of assessment for learning and just over an A4, this is it. So again, congratulations, David, for producing this. I think with this, we've got the basis for an assessment system that's sufficient, appropriate and manageable. And I think those 3 words are equally important, because we don't want to take away the scaffolding of assessment, because when that's been done, it hasn't led to beneficial consequences, let's put it like that. But you don't want to be drowning in assessment data or undertaking assessments for the sake of undertaking assessment. And I think there's been evidence of that in over the years as well, in past experience, that there was so much data being collected, it was being fed into various systems, but nothing was actually being informed in reality by that data, and you wonder, well, what's the point of it? So I think getting that balance right is crucial, and what we've got outlined here gives a basis for schools to take this forward, so that does achieve that, and I think that'll be an important step forward, Chair.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Okay, no one else? Oh, yes, Councillor Sandra Joy.
Sorry, it's the question, Di, is actually about something fairly pedantic, but I'm curious. You've used the word pupil all the way through, and I'm very conscious that this is probably aimed at a very wide age range in our, for our youngsters. Would you consider using the word learner, and if not, why is it more appropriate to use pupil in this?
Really good question. The reason why I tend to use pupils, because that's how we refer to statutory age pupils and those in sixth form in our schools in Swansea. The word learner tends to reflect those who are either not in statutory mainstream education or in FE. So we tend to use the word pupils. I'm not wedded to it. And if learners sit more closely, and then it's a simple change from my perspective, and certainly happy to consider that. And I wasn't sure Helen's got a view on this, and certainly happy to consider that.
The decision we're asking the committee to make this evening is to consider sending this draft really for stakeholder engagement and refinement. Right. So I guess that's a question we can ask stakeholders in terms of their preference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. It's really helpful. Okay, Sandra? Yeah. Okay, no one else indicating at the moment. So, Di, you can continue, please.
Thanks. I'm just going to respond to something that Councillor Lyndon Jones said initially. I'm not going to give the game away because I'm at scrutiny tomorrow with the paper, Lyndon. So I'll hold off on the commitment to responding to the regional and cluster work, if that's okay.
No, sure, absolutely, yeah.
I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on the principles, if I may. However, just some key items for me. We speak about individualized and personalized learning, and that recognizes diverse needs. This is front and center in this item for us. And we've mentioned having clear expectations. What that looks like is really clear learning outcomes. So what is the intended learning outcome, and sharing that really clearly with children and young people, and that indicates how we plan for learning. Having a balanced approach to support and challenge. So we're talking about a balance of support, we're talking about a balance of scaffolding, and we're talking about really considering how we remove that support, so that hand-holding, guiding, and then having a differentiated approach to that. And really important from my perspective is 2.15 is how we feed back and we reflect, and pupils reflect on the feedback that they get, but also how they reflect on their own self-assessment. Internalizing their learning is really, really important. Then, as you've aforementioned, covering both ongoing varied assessment, but formative and summative assessment plays a really clear path in this, and certainly, as indicated by the Cabinet member, we would not want to be creating a system which churns numbers for the sake of it. We speak about inclusivity, 2.17. And it's obvious, but that's not just about including those pupils who have identified ALN. That's having an offer for all pupils. Depends on what day it is, how they're feeling that particular morning. So with an emphasis on removing barriers where we can. And that, again, mentioning that autonomy. So the pupils having an input into the learning journey? How do they express what their learning needs would be, and what say do they have in the design of the learning at all stages? And as we come to a close to the ninth, really, how are we motivating our learning? So what are we recognizing their achievements? Do we structure that well? And how is that used in order to inspire and provide confidence to our children and young people in Swansea? Something that we're key, the word pace often gets scrutinized, but it's got to be appropriate. We're not suggesting that we all get on a horse and canter through lessons. But what we are saying is that we do need to be on it, and we need people to be operating at a pace which is appropriate to learners' needs, but one that isn't too slow either, with a focus on not a gallop or a canter, but one that provides us with pacey and lessons that inspire. And we often forget about this, but learning, it doesn't happen by luck. You often have to build on the prior knowledge. So put simply, do we build on the previous lesson? Do we provide opportunity to reflect on what pupils have learned in the past? And do we progressively build ideas into concepts that can sometimes be quite tricky for children and young people to understand? And linked, of course, to the preparation for children and young people in the world of work, key piece here around the careers and work-related experiences, which one of our officers does a great job at engaging with other education providers in the city. So skills for life. So what does that look like? And how our youngest pupils develop in those skills for life all the way through to transition into the world of work. And just to summarise, as Helen has said, yeah, we're asking for permission to take this to wider stakeholder input so that they can feed into this. Obviously, considering your items that you've considered too.
Thank you, Di. I can't see anyone indicating here. No, we're okay. We're content. The one point that additional point that I noted down there as we went related to the 135, 132. So local areas and those connections, as you said, we've discussed previously, of course, and the idea of difference. And what struck me quite recently, I was listening to a comedian, Tyrone Brito, and he grew up in Tiger Bay. He grew up in Boot Town. And he said, when I grew up, he said, there wasn't difference. We were the same in an incredibly multicultural childhood. And it's very interesting in how we evolve into that sort of context where we don't look for difference, we look for sameness and similarities. And I think that we're heading in that sort of direction now, because we do have a mixture of people from everywhere and intergenerationally, And so it's an important area. It's great to see that here, because it's fundamentally important to safety and security and at a grassroots level. Di, thank you very much indeed. As we went through the committee meetings throughout the year, there was so much discussion and so much detail. I was wondering how we were going to pull this together. And I would take my hat off to you and thank you very much for producing what is a very full and very detailed. And I think it's an easy read as well. There's nothing complex in there. You clarify the key principles and the structure is robust. So with nobody else indicating, can I ask whether committee members are content with the recommendations on page 1 of the report, that the draft policy is approved for engagement with wider stakeholders, and the second recommendation, the draft policy is refined following stakeholder input and brought back to the committee for further approval. Can I ask committee members to indicate, please? Are we happy? Content? Yes, thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everybody. Unanimous approval. Well, that's it. Thank you very much indeed, Di. Okay, so we move on to agenda item number 5. Respect rights and relationships policy for schools, draft behaviour policy. And I know we got Kate Phillips in the room here. I don't know whether Helen wants to say anything to introduce.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Behaviour in schools is a very topical issue currently, and our school stakeholders, our head teachers, our school staff have been exercised really by pupil behaviour for a long time. And about 18 months ago, I think most of my conversations with head teachers and staff in schools were about behaviour. But obviously, the behaviour of a child can manifest in different ways, and there's a broad spectrum of opinion about how best to deal with pupil or learner behaviour. So I think the work that's been undertaken through this committee, and indeed outside of this committee as part of the workshopping of how do we deal with pupil behaviour in Swansea, has been really fruitful. And there will always be polarised opinions about how to deal with pupil behaviour. But I think trying to find the middle ground has always been our strategic intention. It's never been to advocate a particular way, but ultimately what we are trying to do is equip staff in schools to better understand what's required. There are wider considerations around national policy that could be strengthened, but that's not been our remit as part of this work. Our work has been to ensure that our staff and our leaders in school have the benefit of a consistent local authority policy, and also the practical toolkit that Kate will talk to us about in a minute. So this is a different approach in terms of the pupil progression. So we've started with stakeholder input, and this has then reached the point of a draft policy being created. So it's almost the flip model of what we've done with pupil progression. So I won't say any more. I don't steal Kate's thunder, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, wrong button. Thank you very much, Helen. Over to Kate.
Thanks. Thank you. So if it's okay, I'll talk through the report first, because that gives the background and the context, and then just talk through the draft policy. So the report is to present the policy, and we've talked about it in committees over the last year. We've referred to it as behaviour, but always said that we would seek a better name for that. And the output really of the workshops that we've done to date is that we're presenting a policy on respect, rights and relationships for schools. So by way of a kind of introduction to the context around that, I've shared before the Vulnerable Learners Service Inclusion Strategy, and that has 5 key priorities around promoting attendance, promoting inclusion, embedding effective universal whole school provision, a shared inclusion ethos, and a whole school approach to emotional health and psychological well-being. And within the priority of inclusion, we have a current work stream focusing on developing a pupil behaviour strategy, and also a local authority policy for Swansea schools. So the strategic steps include developing a model policy, an exemplar policy for schools as well. That will be based on the local authorities policy. So getting the local authority policy agreed today is a key milestone for us, because we would hope that our school exemplar policy will then mirror that, and then we will develop a toolkit, which we started some work on, and I can share with you in a moment, in relation to providing the support mechanisms for that. So we've given the Service Transformation Committee regular updates on progress, and also really grateful to members who've actually been along to some of the workshops as well and have inputted directly in that way. So grateful for that. Helen's touched on the local and national context, really, in terms of national reporting around behaviour in schools becoming more challenging, and we know that that's been reflected in Swansea schools, and we know also that national data indicates an increasing trend in both fixed term and permanent exclusions from schools. So we're seeking to kind of, to do something to change that. We consider that, every exclusion is potentially a reduced life chance for a learner, and that's supported by research, and we want an approach that will help us to mitigate against that. And what we know is that the increasing trends are indicating that our current approaches are insufficient, so we need to change. We've identified ourselves, and it's backed up by research, that some of the reasons for this are around social and demographic changes, including the impact of the pandemic, poverty and the cost of living crisis, use of social media, substance use, an increase in violent crimes, recruitment challenges in schools, and also challenging budget positions. We also know as well that there's an increase in learners with additional learning needs and those with neurodiversity who require different approaches from those which may have been traditionally offered. So changing our environment and approaches to better suit need is something that we think we can achieve. And we've also noted that there are some inconsistencies in ethos and approach across schools in Swansea. And what we're seeking to do is to achieve a more consistent approach across the whole of Swansea. So the report outlines the policy and legal context as well, and that's really important because when we look at devising our policy, we need to be clear that we're acting in our own remit, our own roles and responsibilities, and that we also identify where schools' remit, roles and responsibilities are. So those two pieces of legislation in relation to Education Act 1998 and the Education Inspection Act 2016 have been key considerations in terms of making sure that we're operating within our legislative requirements. But also we've wanted to pay attention to United Nations Convention's Rights of the Child and also on the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. They're important commitments of Swansea Council, and they aid establishing our vision and ethos in relation to inclusion and help us to develop that shared set of values because we're all signed up to those and need to act within the requirements. And also the Equality Act 2010, which provides that protection for protected characteristics. So in terms of how we developed the policy, a key principle of the development work was stakeholder engagement and co-design, and really important that the policy was devised out of that process. So we've undertaken some activity, which I'll outline for you, which is to ensure we've captured the voice and views and input from as many stakeholders and delivery partners as possible to get the breadth of experience and also input. So we had 4 multi-agency stakeholder workshops between June 24 and January 25. And we had a broad sweep of representation. Schools obviously were key, but not just head teachers, senior leaders, middle leaders, additional learning needs coordinators and our pastoral leads. We've had engagement with our trade unions. They've been attending the workshops. Welsh Government representatives attended, third sector organisations, a number of different organisations we work with. Our school-based counselling service, CAMS, the local health board, Swansea Parent Care Forum have been really key partners, child and family services, youth justice services, the police, education, psychology, the list is long, education officers, school governors and members of the Service Transformation Committee. So in addition to those 4 workshops, we held standalone sessions with head teachers, with chairs of governors and also children and young people. So the input from children and young people was gathered at the Big Voice event on the 28th of January in the National Waterfront Museum. And that included representatives from both primary and secondary school. And we were supported by participation in children's rights team to make sure that that voice was really captured. We also circulated questionnaires to schools and had 23 responses. We've recruited 4 practitioners via an expression of interest process, and they are school-based practitioners. It's really important to us that the themes and principles that emerged from the engagement work were tested, triangulated against existing research, to make sure that we were promoting something, supporting something that had some integrity to it. So, and they've been supported by our lead behaviour support teacher and also an educational psychologist to take that piece of work forward. They're currently working on developing resources for our toolkit. So the draft policy that's presented as an appendix to this report was informed by the feedback and the input of all of these engagement activities. So I think it's really important to emphasise to the committee that nothing in the policy has not come from the stakeholder engagement. It's all come from that completely. We haven't presented something to them for them to consider they've effectively developed the policy. And we have had sessions in place as part of each workshop to moderate that progress so that they can check that what they've said is what we've captured. So finally, a workshop was undertaken just yesterday to share the draft policy for refinement, and there were a few minor refinements, which, if it's okay, I'll share with you when I talk through the policy. They're minimal, but I think it's just they were important and helpful. And obviously we fed through this, we've given reports on this progress throughout. So in total, around 200 participants have taken part in the stakeholder development activity. We've captured a lot of voice and input. So what did it tell us? I think to share with you the findings so that you understand how that policy's been developed. The key issues were identified as being experienced in schools were themed from the feedback, and we've defined them as dysregulation and emotional responses, increased physicality, a gap between home and school expectations, insufficient resource in the local authority to provide support, children with complex needs. There's a specific definition of complex needs, but it was talked about in a kind of broad term, and additional learning needs, and issues of respect. So our stakeholders considered what responses were needed then to address the challenges. And again, we themed their responses and they're listed there, and they're around early intervention and support, training and development, parental involvement and support, consistent policies and procedures, positive reinforcement and relationships, funding and resources, specialist support and training, parental and community engagement, support from external agencies, and consistent and clear guidelines. And what I hope you'll see in the policy is that those themes are all within that policy and represented. And when we then develop a school policy, those themes will be mirrored, and our toolkit will provide the resources, the support and the research to back those themes, so that at any point a practitioner can refer to the toolkit if they need some support guidance on how to implement that. So so that's all been pulled together to support the policy development and implementation. Okay, so if it's okay to touch on the continuum of views, because I think that's important consideration. So Helen touched on, and as I said, we've had such a broad range of engagement that unsurprisingly there was a broad continuum of viewpoints and approaches that were shared throughout the engagement activity. And that's why our legal and policy context is so important, because we have to operate within that. So a key principle of the work is that it was stakeholder led, and we think we broadly achieved that. But it is important to note that there were some elements of the feedback that we won't incorporate because it didn't align with our existing legal framework or policies. So approaches that we didn't see fitted into that. But where this has been the case, we haven't ignored the feedback. So rather than that, we're giving consideration to alternative approaches to addressing the issues raised. We started that in the workshop that we did yesterday, so we've made that commitment to take that forward, and they'll be reflected on an implementation plan which is being drafted to support the implementation of the policy. So the three main examples are in relation to the role of school admissions, and suggestions that some assessment of a child's profile combined with the consideration of current cohorts should be undertaken prior to offer of a school place. So we wouldn't want to do that because that would go against the school admissions code. However, we also recognise that in Swansea we've got a high level of pupil mobility, and so we're looking at an action to take forward from this work to support schools to consider how best to support pupil mobility issues in Swansea, and that will be added to our implementation action plan. There were also some very strong and conflicting views around the use of restraint in mainstream schools, with a request from some stakeholders that mainstream school staff would receive training in the use of restraint. But the local authority have got a really clear position on this, and we operate in line with the Welsh Government guidance on reducing restrictive practices. We provide de-escalation training for all school staff, and we don't consider the use of restraints appropriate in mainstream schools, but we do recognise there are rare occasions where a proportionate physical intervention is needed in an emergency situation, and that's outlined in the Welsh Government guidance, and we're supporting schools to have access to that and to understand how it really works effectively. So the reducing restrictive practices framework is non-statutory, but it does give a clear steer away from more restrictive practices. And so we would accept that, and we would want to advocate that approach further. We also recognise that any physical restraint in school should be within the context of the European Convention on Human Rights and in line with principles described in the Human Rights Framework on Restraint produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So we'll support staff with that, and there's a piece of work that will be undertaken to take that work forward from the summer term. And we've also got a training offer currently that includes a range of trauma-informed responses to understand how school staff can de-escalate behaviours. So, and then the third theme that emerged, which we haven't included, is around the local authority providing definitive guidance on when to exclude. However, we're not in a position to instruct schools over which incidents may or may not warrant an exclusion, as these decisions rest clearly with the head teacher and ultimately the governing body. But again, we recognise that that's something that's causing a level of concern, anxiety, and so we propose to undertake a supplementary piece of work to form part of the toolkit, which will better achieve consistency in exclusion decisions. So, other than those, the remaining feedback was collated and evaluated, and it results in the following principles which have guided the policy, and they're reflected in the policy. So it's well-being of the whole school, engagement, belonging and relationships, high quality training, early intervention, multi-agency working, an inclusive curriculum, a back to basics approach, which I'll touch on in a moment, a behaviour toolkit, specialist provision, graduated responses, reasonable adjustments and sharing good practice. And these principles were broadly in line with the approaches advocated by the local authority, with the exception of back to basics, and where some of the comments and feedbacks were a bit contradictory to some of our key principles of inclusion. So what we did was revisit that theme in a workshop to make sure we were really clear about what we all meant by it. What we've settled on is that the new behaviour policy has to be underpinned by legislation, but also supported by the principle of our inclusion strategy, if it's to be advocated by the local authority. And so we're supporting a stakeholder agreed definition of back to basics as an approach to build good relationships, set clear boundaries and expectations, and that's outlined in the draft policy. And we'll also be using the training and toolkit as an opportunity to support this approach and support it being implemented consistently. Okay, so point 7 is around the draft policy. So I'll just turn to that in a moment. But just before I do, I just wanted to say that if the committee are willing to agree the recommendation and accept the policy today, our next steps will be to develop a school exemplar policy, which can be adopted and personalised by schools to suit their individual context, but it will be rooted in the framework of the local authority behaviour policy. So it exactly, but it will also provide the facility for it to be personalised. And it will include additional details such as links to key documents and policies to support the implementation. So they'll include, but they're not limited to, guidance on exclusions, mobile phone use, social media, bullying, anti-racism. We'll have some sample parental agreements, documents to support self-evaluation, checklists and so on, a raft of stuff, and that's what our practitioners are working on at the moment. And we will also develop an implementation plan to make sure we capture the actions, specifically those detailed in section 5 around the bits that we haven't included in the policy. So the policy is in Appendix A, and it's I wasn't going to talk you through it all. It's there for people to have read, but if it's okay to just share the feedback from the committee from this workshop around the slight amendments they want.
Yes, please do, Kate.
Okay, so if I just turn first of all to page 4. So there was point 2, encourage parental carer and community engagement. The first bullet point says ensure all members of the school community understand the importance of taking care of each other in the school environment. The suggested changes support all members of the school community to understand the importance, because we can't always ensure that everybody does it, but we can support everybody to do so. So that was the first suggested change. The next ones are on page 6. So on principles of behaviour, for the first paragraph, respect, learners, it said originally learners should show respect. What we're proposing to change is learners should be supported to show respect. It also then said all learners have the right to learn in an environment free from disruption. The suggestion was that we change that to an environment with minimal disruption, because we can't ever guarantee that something will be completely free from disruption. And then respect the professional expertise of school staff. The suggestion was just respect school staff and remove professional expertise. Second paragraph, rights, learners, did say learners should recognise their rights. We're suggesting a change to learners should be supported to recognise their rights. So we're not fundamentally changing the meaning. It's just that's on that page. And then there aren't many. Page 8, or actually it's on page 7 of yours probably, because I've moved, as I've amended it, it's moved slightly. So the last bullet point of schools provision, the very last bullet point says ensure support from external agencies. We're suggesting a change to facilitate support from external agencies. Again, we don't.
Is that on page? Sorry, Kate. Is that on page 6? Page 6. 38 or 39? Oh, it's on. Right. Okay. Lovely. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. And then finally on my page 9, the heading is the 10 collective responsibilities. Page 8, is it? Page 8, thank you. Sorry. 10 collective responsibilities, yeah. So on 4 and also on 6, remove the use of the phrase behaviour management. So it's 4 consistent policies and procedures, develop and maintain consistent policies and procedures, full stop. And funding and resources, ensure adequate funding and resources, full stop. Or to support initiatives, full stop. It would be better. Learning where to put the full stop is important. And that was it. They're the proposed. That's what came out of the workshop yesterday. I think they don't fundamentally alter any of the meaning or principles, but they just give a bit of a more sensible nuance to some of it. That's it. So happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kate. Do we have questions in the room? Questions online? Please indicate. Councillor Mike White.
Yes, thank you, Kate. Thank you for the both report for this report as well. Just to clarify, do all the schools in Swansea have the right to respect? Are they signed up to them? Can you clarify that? So we know that the schools know exactly what is expected when it regards to rights to respect. Also, when you refer to obviously children needing support and issues that might be of concern to the school, we have got issues where plus we're waiting for referrals or something for the children we put in place, which causes a lot of frustration for obviously for the school, the parent or guardian, and which affect the pupils. But plus not only through us but through agencies as well. What provisions have we got to perhaps look into that? I know sometimes it might be perhaps there's not that specialist person available or on a post, or but I think that's an issue that schools obviously have concerns with as well. And also in regards to the issue of the protection with the staff, for the staff to be work safely. Can we, if possible, make sure that the staff know the procedure, has the training, so that they know that in the event of something happening, that they know exactly what the procedure is and who they need to report up to and what needs to be done in regards to actually documenting the issue that has cropped up. As I say, but if we could perhaps look at that, and perhaps if some of this could be perhaps linked in within the guidance of the toolkit, which then could be rolled out to schools to implement within the new policy. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. So in terms of the first one, whether or not schools are signed up, so the ask today is that the committee accept the policy. This is the local authority policy then. If that's accepted, we would then develop the school policy from this policy, because this would be the kind of the overarching principles. And then we would develop the school policy to mirror it. We've started some work on that tentatively in anticipation. But then the next piece of work then would be ensuring that our schools are in agreement with it. I think what's important to note, though, is that schools have been engaged in this process all the way along through our workshops. They've been attending the workshops. We've had teacher meetings, we've been to governors' meetings. So there's a high level of visibility around it. But we're at that stage. That's the first point. Do you want?
Helen?
I can come in, Councillor White. I understood your question as asking about rights respecting schools and signing up to that commitment that was initially launched in 2013. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, in regards to restorative practice, Helen.
Okay, so in terms of restorative practice, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a different scheme to rights respecting schools as part of UNESCO Rights of the Child. But what I can say about that is in its original launch, all schools in Swansea were signed up, and some have made incremental progression in terms of accreditation around that. But obviously some of the accreditation requires funding, and that would be a school's delegated decision in terms of whether they want to carry on. But certainly those principles that were established in terms of rights respecting education in Swansea are very much part of the DNA of our schools across the board still. But I'm not sure who signed up to the different accreditation parts of that currently. In terms of restorative practice, I know Kate has got more to say about that. And obviously there was a strong tradition of restorative practice in Swansea historically. And I think there is a need potentially to revisit that, Councillor White. So it's a good point you raise.
Lovely. Thank you, Helen. Kate?
Yeah, thanks. I'll answer the other questions in a second. But yeah, just to pick up on that point about restorative practice, that was a theme actually. A lot of feedback from the workshops around schools recognising that perhaps some of those restorative approaches, while the intent and the commitment was still there, perhaps they had kind of become a bit diluted over time, and they were looking for a refresh really in relation to that approach. So we've taken that as part of the feedback, and we've got a commitment to invest some of our grant funding into supporting all schools in Swansea to reinvigorate that approach. And we've got an event coming up where we'll be offering some support and training and taking that forward. So that's very much going to be part of the toolkit and part of the implementation plan. So to give you a bit of reassurance around that.
Thanks, Kate. Sorry to jump in quickly, but I just now while we're on the point, because I made a note earlier about 621 about pupil mobility. The idea of Mike Dirk and Councillor Smith, well, Robert Smith, we have a TIFF today and we're not going to school tomorrow, so attendance goes down, and then I'm not going back to that school. So one of the potentials with restorative practice to get Robert and Michael to shake hands and go back to school the next day, and then we resolve the problem. Is that the context?
Yeah, sure, partly, absolutely. And so we can do that within schools in terms of the restorative approaches to, maintaining all relationships. It's all about building positive relationships and supporting, kind of engagement and restorative approaches. Separately to pupil mobility, yes, when we look at the work on admissions, we can certainly consider that as part of it, because we do see that happening in Swansea, because we're a relatively compact geographical area. Families can make those choices, and obviously consistency generally is the best for children. So yeah, and how we do that within the context of respecting parental decisions as well is important. So certainly part of the work stream. The second question was around what happens when referrals are being put in place in terms of either the time that it takes for those mechanisms to generate some support. So The toolkit will be really important there. So external agencies or indeed referrals into more specialist provision within the local authority do have time constraints to them, and sometimes that's for good reason, particularly in relation to specialist places. You know, we need to be absolutely certain, we need to have a period of assessment and understanding to make sure that it's absolutely the right thing for the child or the young person. But the intention is with our toolkit that we will be strengthening the availability, access, or just visibility of resources. There's lots of support out there, but it's not necessarily held together in a coherent place. So the intention is to try and bring that together better so that schools and families know better where they can seek support and guidance. And then I think your final point was around staff understanding what to do in terms of when there were issues in schools in relation to behaviours. So the school policy, exemplar policy, when it's finalised, will go into more detail than this local authority policy. The local authority policy is intended to be a higher level in terms of principles and approaches. And then what we hope to achieve with the school exemplar policy is that will, for every principle, if you like, that's been stated, there'll be a link to practical support and guidance, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Kate. Is that okay, Mike?
Yes, as I say, but I think it's really important that staff know the procedure and they know exactly what, who they might have to report up to, whatever. But the event is actually logged as well. I think that's important for the interest and the safety of the member staff, because you know what it's like, an allegation gets made and then we go down a different road of disciplinary.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. And Councillor Lyndon Jones, please.
Just a few points, Mike. First of all, well done, Kate, really, and the team, because I think a lot of work has gone into this, and it's really clear. And the big thing about it is that it's been stakeholder-led, as you mentioned. And we've all seen the difficulties of behaviour in schools, particularly since COVID, and showing support for those schools and actually having a proper framework is really, really important. So that was the main point I wanted to make. The only thing is, can we have, you made a few changes to this document. Can we have the document with those changes in?
Of course,
Finally.
yeah, certainly. I
Thank
get
you.
it circulated by Gareth, that's right, I can send to.
Councillor Sandra Joy.
Yes, I was just going to pick up on one of those changes that was announced, that was mentioned based on what was discussed yesterday. The one on page 6 where it talks about under principles of behaviour.
So, sorry, Sandra, yesterday? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Oh, the report yesterday. Sorry, miles away, sorry. I'll concentrate now, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. The changes, instead of learners should show respect for themselves, others and property, it's learners should be supported to show respect for them. Now, I think that's quite a significant change because it takes the onus off the young person and puts it on other people. And I wonder whether instead of that, something to consider is that we leave it as it is. Learners should show respect, because I think the majority are able to do that and have the knowledge to do that. But maybe to put an addition on the end there to say it is acknowledged that some learners may need support to achieve this.
Yeah, good suggestion.
Yeah. And obviously the same on the rights thing as well.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you, Sandra. Excellent. Lyndon, your hand is still up. Do you want to come back in? No. Okay. Councillor Robert Smith.
Yes, and I fully endorse what the amendment that Sandra's proposed there, because learners should be showing respect. That's an expectation, and I think it needs to be spelt out in the policy, in the culture in which we're living at the moment. And yes, there will be some learners who will need support to achieve that, but I think that expectation should stand. again, want to thank Kate for the work that's gone into this, and the other people that have collaborated with her to produce this. What I think this gives is a solid basis for us as a local authority and for our schools in Swansea to move forward. But let's remember that this needs to be part of a broader approach. Welsh Government need to be on board, and they have things they need to be doing. And there are broader, even broader cultural and social issues that need to be addressed if we're going to deal with the kind of problems that have emerged in the last 5, 6, 10 years. And I think, you know, the level of issues that we're dealing with is a lot different to what they were even 5 years ago. And I think that has to be recognised both by ourselves and by others like Welsh Government and more broadly. So I think that's a point that perhaps we need to make while we're launching this policy as well, Chair.
Thank you very much, Robert. I can't see anyone else indicating. I can't see anyone online. There's just 1 or 2 points that I'd make. I remember a few years ago we all undertook training on co-production, co-design and that sort of thing, and many of the questions were like, how, right? Really, how are we going to do this? I think this is an outstanding example of how we can tackle even the biggest challenges that we face by trying to throw a net over all of the stakeholders. And Kate, that is really impressive. I know you weren't responsible for the technology used in the workshops, and you would be the first to admit that, but a really very effective way of capturing all of the views from all of the attendees, and then going above and beyond to bend over backwards to get as many perspectives as we possibly can. And that is, I think, a real example of best practice to be learned from across the country, really, for others who are thinking of doing similar things. The restraint approach, can I say how much I welcome the focus on restraint? It is a very sensitive area. And in my experience in other roles in the past, there's that a concern for people who have never been in the most pressurised and difficult and challenging circumstances with children. And what we're taking is an approach which is absolutely child-centred. This is not about punitive, this is about empathy, it's about child-centred approach. And I'd encourage anyone who wants to understand as to what this is about, is to access some of the links in the organisations you've referred to. It is excellent to see that as well. So my final point is to say thank you and to thank all of the stakeholders, to thank committee members for their enthusiasm and commitment over time. And in what, as Councillor Smith says, and I completely endorse, it's such an important area of work for us that impacts on how many children in Swansea schools, 40,000 thereabouts, heading for 40,000 children. So this is critically important work. So committee members, can I ask you please to look at the recommendation on page 1. Can we, it is recommended that the draft, can I put in there, the draft amended policy is approved. Is that acceptable, Gav? I think it is okay, isn't it, with the amendments have been discussed and clarified, so that the committee approved the draft amended policy. Is that, are we content, committee? Can you please indicate? You okay? Yeah, and online? Brilliant, that's lovely. Well, thank you all very much indeed for that. I think 2 hugely significant and brilliantly put together reports. Thank you to Kate, and again, thank you, Di. So we move on to agenda item number 6, which is the work plan for the year. And we are up to the 19th of February. So we've got our next meeting on the 9th of April. Policy on the principles of pupil progression, final report, and the annual report 2024-2025. Are there any amendments that we need to be mindful of in timings, Helen, or is that to be content? Is there any other consideration there?
No, I think because we've had permission to gauge on pupil progression today, that will give us enough time between now and the 31st of March to engage with key stakeholder groups and refine principles of pupil progression, bring it back then as the finished article to the committee in April.
That is excellent. I can't see anyone indicating. I can see people are content. And can I thank you all once again for your efforts and for your commitment and enthusiasm. And on that point, I'll close the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.